Thanks. So, can you guys all hear me pretty good? Way at the back. Sound okay? Cool. Yeah, so like when we're going around, people kind of looking for jobs, shouting out their name. It's like, man, everyone should shout out their name. But anyways, my name's Sam, and I want to talk to you tonight about React Router. So you see my screen pretty good there? I'm going to change this a little bit. So I'm one of the founders and organizers of React Minneapolis. We've been going for about a year now. Coming up August is our 12th meetup. So it's been great having all of us together and creating this community. And I'm really excited to see everyone here. If you want to have a look at the slides, you can pull them up here on that link right there. And you can follow along on your own then as well. So who here knows what a router does? Everyone knows what a router does. OK, what about, for those who don't know, because not everyone raised their hand, I think. A router basically allows us, in our context, allows us to, say, have a diagram here that looks at different pages or screens within your application. A router takes care of the infrastructure around taking you from any one to any one of the other ones. So it kind of is a very key component. React Router, the package, is pretty much the main routing solution for React applications. So what about React Router itself? Who here has used React Router? Who here hasn't used React Router? Don't feel ashamed. Cool. So I see a couple of votes here. So I'm going to focus a little bit more on, I guess, the transition to version 4. Who here has used version 4 of React Router? OK, so there's a good mix here. OK, so that means I have a whole room of experts who can answer all the difficult questions at the end. Yay. Cool. So why version 4? So this was one of the, it happens a lot in JavaScript. There's churn, right? So there's a lot of releases, there's new versions. They just released a new version of React Router. I think it was officially March this year. Here's version 4. But it was right on the heels of a newer version, version 3. And so version 4 changes everything. They wanted to really fix some of the problems that had occurred as they used React Router, as they taught about React Router. And they're like, well, we can't just fix this through incremental changes. We actually have to rethink this and build it from the ground up a little bit differently. And there's going to be a break in API. So that's why it changed from version 3 to version 4. The API is different. But there's some good news. And the good news for you, if you've used version 3, is that there's a lot of similarities. And the API is still very small. Like React, React has a very small sort of API surface. It's not a ton of things to know, and once you know them in your head, you can just start creating components. It's not like you always have to be checking back to the manual to find out what the name of a variable is or something like that. So some of their goals in recreating React Router were to make it more component-driven. So if you had experienced in version 3, things kind of looked like components, but they didn't really act like real React components. They were a little bit strange, a little bit odd now and again. They also wanted to make it as good as React. That's a real quote. Make it a really good router. Also give support for React Native and deep linking within React Native apps. So those are kind of their big high-level goals. So I told you that the API surface was pretty small. So these are the main components that you're going to be using. And you can kind of memorize them all. I mean, there's basic things. So there's a router. And actually, I kind of tricked when I said there's just one of those routers, because there's actually 4. But you have a router. Then you have a route, a switch, a link, and a redirect. There's other things to learn. That the docs are actually really well written. And I encourage you to have a look at them. But this is the gist of React Router is in these 5 components. I meant to say at the beginning, if you have any questions as I'm going, just feel free to shout out. So the first thing is router. So the router component basically provides a context, and I don't mean that in a generic sense. I mean that in a very React-specific sense. Context allows you to pass variables, values down into child components. And so if you wrap everything in a router, any of your child components, and particularly the ones that React Router provides, have access to this context and can interact with it. So you have to have the router because it provides that overall sort of infrastructure. And then there's different routers for different environments. So we've got browser router, which I'm going to focus entirely on the browser router. There's also hash router, memory router, and static router. Now, I'm not experienced much with React Native. I haven't built a React Native application. There's also a package called React Router that they kind of separated the release. There's the core React Router. There's React Router DOM, which is what we would use for like a web application. And then there's React Router native package, which you can install. So I don't know a ton about native, so I don't want to pretend I do. So I encourage you, the docs are really good for the web one. I think they'll probably be pretty good for the React Native one as well. So these are all DOM level routers, or they can be used in the DOM context. So we've got the browser router, the hash router. So if you were supporting Internet Explorer 8, for example, then you have issues with updating the URL directly in the browser. And so you have to have that little ugly slash hash slash in front of all your URLs to make it work with older versions of Internet Explorer. If you don't have to deal with those sorts of support constraints, then you would just use browser router. And then the other two are useful for situations where you're doing testing, so you can use a static router or a memory router as well. So this is how you would, this is kind of more for intro level, but if you have an application, that all you have to do is add browser router around your app. So your app is your core component for your application. You wrap it around that, and now you can use React Router components inside of that application. They don't all have to be at the top level like they used to with version 3, and you can use them in different places. So the real core of React Router is this route component. So essentially, you give it a URL, and if it matches, it will render something with 1 or 2 caveats. So there's 3 different modes, and I'm going to, in the example, I'm going to show you these 3 different modes that you can use. And there's a prop that you'll add for each one. And you can use these anywhere. They're just a component, a regular component. They don't have to be at the top level. You can use them to conditionally show a component deep within your application on, you know, the 5th, 10th page, whatever. So let's just kind of have a look at an example of this. So we have the route. We say, here's the path. If this path matches the URL, then render this component Easter egg. So in your context, Easter egg is a particular React component. Render it out, and really straightforward. Also, you can handle in named parameters, and then these become available within the mounted component. So in this case, the house component could look at its props and look for match params house ID and determine what that house ID that was in the URL without having to do any of its own work to figure out what the URL contained, what the ID was. It's just handed straight into that component for its use. And then the other one is switch. So now let's imagine we have a situation where you only want to render one of a set of routes. What switch will do is it will keep searching sequentially through your routes, and the first one it finds that matches, it says, okay, I render that one, and I'm done, and it skips the rest of them. So it's really useful if you think about it for catching cases like 404s or things like that, where you want to default way down the end to catch a 404, and I'll show an example of that too. Sorry, that kind of scrolled out of direction there. And the other thing that matters a lot when you're using a router is you have to get from A to B. So in React Router, you have this link component, and you specify, here's the URL I want to link to. And this actually just looks like a typical anchor tag in HTML. So it renders exactly like that. But you can customize that. And so this allows the user to initiate that. And then in the spirit of declarative rather than imperative programming, so by this I mean, if we have an example where we want to state, when this happens, I want to do this, rather than command that, it's a little bit, I guess, difficult to articulate. But in this case, declaratively, we render a component that takes care of handling the situation. So you just render a redirect, and this seems like a little bit like magic. It will redirect the user. No matter what else is on that page, it will redirect them automatically. So that means that using props, you can determine, hey, should I render a redirect, or should I render some other content? And when you render the redirect, the next thing the user sees is they're snapped off to that next route, okay? So it's a bit of a different mindset, rather than an imperative model where we might decide, okay, I need to find a history object and call the push method on the history object and give it the URL that I want to go to. And in fact, you still can do that in React Router 4. It's just further down. They've kind of encouraged more this declarative approach. So they haven't hindered you really from using the imperative approach if you need to. So it's just some high-level differences. We're going to jump into an actual comparison between a version 3 app and a version 4 app side by side. But just high-level ones. So route in version 3 didn't really act like a component. It does now. There was an index route component before. Now we just use route and have an exact prop that we can hand it and say, this will give us our index route. So I'll show you an example of that. And also you can nest these routes and put them in reusable components. And by doing so, you can have these dynamically rendered routes that will only show in certain situations. So what I'd like to do now is just jump into like a little bit of code comparison between these two. So there's a link here. If you're following the slides, this is not my code. This is someone else did a nice little app that had a version 3 app and a version 4 app. So I'm just going to show those pieces to you before we jump into the application with the fun animations. So that's way too small. And we'll go all the way to the top. How's that for size in the back? Is it visible? Good, okay. All right, so on the left-hand side is version 3, and on the right-hand side is version 4. So you see right here, the first thing that we define in React Router version 3, we had to define a router object, pardon me, and we had to define our history object that we were going to use. And then directly within that router component, we then would have our routes. So here, this would give a wrapper route that we would wrap around all of our routes. And then inside of that, we would have basically our index route, our about topics, and then a specific topic here. So now let's have a look on the right-hand side, and you'll see things look really quite differently. So we import browser router, and this is just a little trick. It just renames it as router, but by doing so, this has access to the browser history, and it's hooked up as that type of router. So then you don't have to hand in the history prop. So we have router wrapping a div. Doesn't have to be direct childs. Route components don't have to be direct children of routers. And so we have a div object in there. And what's kind of a little bit strange at first is we're actually just going to render what was in this wrapper component on the version 3 app. We're just going to render that directly. This is still a regular component. So we can just render our navigation right at the top of our basic example application component. Here we're using the links, very similar to version 3. not much change there. And then instead of doing our index route and so forth, we just have our route exact. So this means that it won't kind of be greedy and look for, because when you do a pattern match here, this one I'm highlighting on the right-hand side, route exact path. I don't know if you can't see my highlighting. So right here, route exact path, this would match everything beginning with a slash, not only a slash, but by adding exact, we say, okay, we don't want to, if it has more than a slash, we don't want to match it. And then rather than having all of this information here, so this is version 3, we just render our routes with topics, and then inside of that, we can decide what to do with this kind of sub route of topic ID, okay? And inside of the topic route, you'll see that we now have this ability to see a match prop that gets passed through. So React Router hands that into the component that we rendered. And with this, we can access certain information. We can get the URL, and we can also see the named parameters if we have any on this particular route. So it's pretty useful. And then you'll see down here, on looking at a specific topic, that we use that match. Here's using that parameters. The topic ID that we defined earlier, it has access to that. So if we're at /topic/2, the value here would be 2. Does that make sense? Any questions? And you kind of see how it differs over on the left from version 3. So we'll look at topics. So it hands it through here into topic. So topic is its own route here on the left, and it gets it as params. Okay? So any questions kind of about the basic comparison between version 3 and version 4? Cool. Great. So let's minimize that. So now I want to show you a little example app with some animations. So this is a completely created application, and basically shows a React Router application with some animations, because it's kind of fun to actually do some animations, and some animations are harder or trickier to do. There's not a lot of documentation out there for animations. There's a couple things on the docs page, and then you kind of run aground. So I thought it's kind of fun to show you some animations, some ways that you can do it. And actually, if any of you have used React Router 4 and animations, we can maybe have an interesting discussion at the end about how you've approached animations as well. So first I'm going to show you what Housetopia looks like. So if you're looking for a house in Minneapolis, St. Paul, then you would be looking for houses, right? So Housetopia would help you find the perfect house. So you might be interested in these houses. Really simple application. These actually are not, only one of them is in Minneapolis, if you are looking for a house. And I made up all the addresses, so they aren't real places either. But essentially what we have here is we have a house listing. You can click on a house, and it gives you a page that has some information, some summary information about the house, a map, and you can then request viewing. And so there's just 2 simple animations here. So there's the one when you click on a particular card here, and it morphs into a different route. And if you see what happens in the address bar, which is unfortunately very small, that says house/7894. And then this again is another sub-route. So this takes you to house 7894/viewing. But when you do that, you get some nice animations that some slide over and some things change and so forth. So that's the basics that we're going to do. Now I'm going to show you what I have locally. So you can actually pull the finished one up, housetopia.sjparsons.com. And the local one has no animations, right? So this is just as basic as it comes, right? So this is just snaps right away from the different views. So all the routes are there. And what I'm going to show you is just kind of walk through the application, kind of give you a sense of the structure of it, and then I'm going to show you how to put together those animations. And we're going to do a little bit of magic at the end because the final animation is a little bit tricky, so I'm just going to show it to you and not actually live code it. Because otherwise we'd be here for a while and you might be bored. So with that in mind, we're going to make this bigger. OK, so this is a standard Create React app application, fairly vanilla out of the box. Inside of the app.js, this is, actually I should go index.js first for you. So here I included browser router from React Router. I wrapped my application component, and then we're just going to dive into the application component and look at it from there. So the application component imports some other components from our components folder. We use a switch here. And oh, I should show you one final thing. I'll talk about it first. So the switch, remember, that says only match one of the following routes. So if you have 3 routes there, it finds the first one, and that doesn't render anymore. So what we do here is we see, OK, is it the index route? OK, then render the home component. If it's on house/house ID, then we want to match, we'll render the house component. And I'm showing you here a different mode of using route component. Instead of actually just handing in a component directly, I'm calling a render function. So there's a render prop you can give it, and it will render this function or run this function as a render function anytime that the route matches. So anytime that the URL matches house and then a house ID, then it will run this function and return and render the results. So here, instead of having my house component know about match and params, I basically just took the match params and handed it in as an ID into the house component, just to show you kind of how you would use this. And then we have a route component not found. So this is our 404. So if it doesn't match the index and doesn't match house/an ID, then we're going to render a not found component. So I didn't show you that in the initial demo, so I'll demonstrate that for you. So this is me going to ASDF. Oh, that didn't work. Yeah, so where I deployed it, it doesn't have redirecting. So let's do it locally here. So it renders a not found component that says, oh, we can't find this, sorry. And then you click on Housetopia, it comes back to the landing page. OK, so I'm just going to talk a little bit about the components, just so you have enough context to understand what we're going to talk about. But I don't want to waste too much time on that. So the main things we need to know about is that you have your home component, which renders our house list. And then we have a house component, which renders an individual house. OK, so if we look at home, we'll see here it says, OK, there's a little welcome message, and then it renders a house list. And I just have a JavaScript file that defined my houses, and I can include that everywhere. So we don't even have an API here. And so that gives us house list. So I'll just show you house list. We're on the home page still. So this uses a little component called grid, which just gives us a little bit of a responsive grid. So it does something, allows you to look at. So it just snapped it down to smaller columns as you make it smaller. Nothing real fancy there. And then we take all the houses that we got from our data, and then we map through those and output a house card component for every single one of them. So if we look at our home page, this is made up of 6 house card components, which are rendered by the house list component. So I'll show you that too. So here, this is the heart of it. We have a link to the house, the ID of the house. And then we have an image, output out the address information, and we're done. There's some styling information. So this is using style components. I don't want to dig deep into that, but basically allows us to apply our CSS right here within the JavaScript. So there's no other CSS files apart from a top level index.css. And like I was talking about, the link one, if you've used React Router, you're really comfortable. This is just going to, when you click anywhere inside of this element, you're going to be redirected to the specific house. So let's go back to the application again. So from the top level, we've kind of gone to the depth of home route. Now let's look a little bit at this house route and how that works. So what it renders here is the house components. We hand in a parameter. So let's look in here. And this is a little bit more complex because we have to have an API key for the Google map. We have our kind of general house details information, styles here. So these are individual components. Just for ease of use, I just put them in this same file because they're not reused anywhere else. If you're obviously doing something much larger, you would put them in a separate file and maybe reuse them, but we don't need to do that here. So we then have a house title. So this has specific styling for the title that's on top of the image. And then we have the core of the component. Now, I structured this in a little bit of an odd way to demonstrate a couple of the features of React. So, or React Router. So first of all, this one is not odd, but it's pretty common. If you want to scroll to the top whenever you go to a new link in React Router, this is actually just straight out of the documentation. You create a little scroll to top on mount, and declaratively, rather than imperatively, it scrolls you to the top every time that you render this component. So this is like the simple approach. If you want to do like management of scroll position and things like that, then you can have a lot more fun. Then we have a house image. Again, we reuse the same one that we had before, but we specify here height of 300 pixels. And then we put the house title on top of our image. And then the fun things here that's corresponding with React Router is this route component. So this is a different, remember I told you there was 3 modes. The third mode, instead of rendering a component or calling a render function every time it matches, this will call the children function here, even if it doesn't match. So this route and all the contents here, so if we look, everything I've got highlighted, which you probably can't see on the screen. So this whole if-else blocks here is run every single time, even if we're not on the viewing route. So we have route path and then the house ID viewing. So even if we're not on the viewing route, it still runs this every time. But the match object here is set differently. So if there's a match, then we have an object here with the params and the URL and things like that. And if not, then it's just a null. So that means that we can do things conditionally. So if it matches, we can render this chunk of stuff. And if it doesn't match, we can render some other things. So it gives you a lot of power. Now, this isn't probably an ideal situation yet for why you might want to do this. I think the ideal situation is if you always want to render a given component, but you want to change some props for it when it's on a different route, is a nice way to do that. So you can keep that same component mounted at all times, regardless of whether you're on the sub route, and do some different things. So that's what I'll show you with that animation in a minute. So this is kind of in a strange setup so that we can show you the initial state. And then that's it. So any questions on this part yet? Cool. Silence is good, I guess. So what we're going to do is change this. Let's change, yeah. So here's our initial state. We have, that animation isn't there yet, the one for the card. And the animation we're going to work on is when you request a viewing, instead of just snapping to the next route, we want to slide over this section here. So we want it to perform just like our final. I'll show it again. So when we click request a viewing, we want 2 things to occur: the header to slide up and the main content to slide over. Okay? So just a simple animation in one level, but the approach that we're going to take here is actually to mount all three of those components. So you've got a map, a summary, and then a form on the right-hand side. We're going to mount all of those all the time. And then there's going to be a container that contains those three components, and we'll shift right if we want to, if we're on a sub-route. So we're going to use this children mode, the third mode of routes, which allows us to always render something, but we get a match value or variable that we can do something with and change the actual mounted components in a certain situation. And the other thing that we're going to do, and this is really easy, is changing the height of that top area, okay? So you see when you go back, it has this look that everything kind of swipes over, but there's two things happening at the same time, okay? So let's get started. We've got our route right here. So we're going to, this route with the children mode means that this function always will run, even if it doesn't match the given path. So we want to change things a little bit. So rather than switching which of these chunks we want to display, we actually want to display the house details all the time. And let's get this map. So if you kind of look at the code here, we repeat this code in two places. So we're going to get rid of that. So we're going to combine these together. So we have a house details that has the map, the house summary, and the request viewing form all together. And we use some CSS to drop those into separate columns right next to each other. So let's get rid of that. We'll get rid of our if block, and we're just going to always return this whole chunk. And we can get rid of all of this stuff because we don't use it now. And we can see whether I caused an error or not. Okay, so here's our local one. And what you'll see is, because of the styles, this is using like a flex layout, and each component in the flex layout is a width of 50%. So it gives us a total width of 150% of the window. Okay, so you've got two columns that are 50%, and then a third column that's also 50%. So obviously this isn't what we want yet, but we are rendering all of the components. So we're kind of stepping closer to our goal, right? Now, what we need to do here is basically, if you're familiar with CSS a lot, we need a container that's around the one that has this 150% width. And we want to specify an overflow of hidden so that if it goes beyond its bounds, it doesn't hide it. But the actual container that has all three of them, we don't want to make that overflow hidden, because then we'll never see this third column ever, even if we adjust the offsets, okay? So first of all, I'm going to put a container around our house details component that will have an overflow of hidden, okay? So let's do that. I've got one right here I made earlier, but it's really simple. So this is a style component. Basically, it says create a React component, define the styles as width of 100% with an overflow of hidden. So just standard CSS, okay? So now we're going to use this house details viewer. And now let's wrap it around our house details. So it kind of gives us a little bit of a view frame around the house details. Okay, so let's see what happened here. Reloads. So now, oh yeah, let's go here. So as you see, we can scroll right. There's a strange kind of presentation here. I think it has to do with my zooming. If you see that little gradient there on the right. But our other column has disappeared now, right? So just so that you kind of know that the other column is there, I want to show you a little bit of how we're going to achieve this animation. Let's look here at the actual elements, the HTML elements. So we're going to pull off our class here. This is the one here. You probably can't see this yet. but we'll try and make it visible. So there it is. This is the container one that we just created. It has a width of 100% and overflow of hidden. Great. So now let's look at the div inside of that. This is our hotel details. Well, let's try setting the left offset 10 pixels. Okay, so we don't want to go that direction, right? Let's go minus 10 pixels. You see what's happening here? So as we go slowly, you can see that the other column is being revealed, even though it's hidden. So we already had it mounted, and we're just going to slide it over and make it seem as if it got mounted, okay? So that means the only thing that we really have to do now is just change a CSS prop based on whether or not the match object is true or not. So let's have a look at how we could do that. As you'll see here, my house details already looks for a left offset prop. So we can hand that in, and then it will adjust based on this route. So we're going to set left offset on our house details. So let's just do something first of minus 25%, for example, and let it reload. We kind of want it to be over a little bit, kind of in a weird state, okay? So you can see we've slid our kind of our containing container. Our container, we've slid it over 25%. So we're in between places. So what we really want to do is when it matches, we want to move it over 50%, right? So we see the second and third columns. And when it doesn't match, we want to set it to 0 and see just the first and second columns. So instead of just hard coding that, we can use that match prop that's handed in here. Yeah, so in this case, in all cases, the match prop is going to contain, it's going to either be undefined if it doesn't match. So in our case, in the children mode, it's going to be undefined if it doesn't match this path. So if we can then just say, just a kind of a Boolean of it. But in other cases, it's going to be an object, and it's going to have a params attribute inside there, which would have, say, your house ID, which would be set to like 23 or something, and so forth. So there's a couple of other things in that match object as well, which I don't remember all of them off the top of my head. So all we're doing is just a simple false question on it. Is it an object or is it undefined? So we can then just say match. So if it matches, then we want to make it minus 50%. And otherwise, just set it to 0. So let's see if this works. So you see that? Now, you might be wondering, well, why is it kind of making it look really smooth going back and forth? Well, I kind of set up a little trick there for you. If we look here at our left offset, in CSS, this is just using a regular CSS transition. So we say, whenever you change the left property in CSS, add a little bit of delay, 200 milliseconds, and it'll just take a little longer for it to happen, and you let the browser be in charge of making it look smooth back and forth. Okay, so just regular CSS, but handling the interactivity of it here with React Router, okay? So the other thing that we wanted to change was our house image as well. So right now, that's outside of our route. Well, if we want to do something based on the route, we need to put it in here. So we have to wrap a div around all this stuff. We put our house image in there, and then we have our house details viewer. So put that there. I have to have an end div here. Does that look good? It's pretty good. So all we've done here is just move things around. Make sure that still works. And in a very similar fashion, based on this match attribute here, we want to hand in the height. So let's say if it matches, then we want to set it to 150 pixels. Otherwise, set it to 300. So let's just double check this works. So there we go. So the key idea here is that you can use this children mode of the route component to always render things and then update them and change them. So they're mounted and you're just moving them around and morphing them by updating props on them rather than starting a new mount, which sometimes is what you want to do, but sometimes you want to just change things as you change routes. So you still get the nice URLs that someone could copy and paste and give someone else, but we are kind of moving things around, okay? So the second one I wanted to show you, which I won't dive deep into, I'm just gonna say, hey, this is kind of, there's an example here you can look at, is the animation of the card into the house. So like my experience with animations, almost all the time, what we're trying to do, you think like, let's maybe back up a second here. If you look at this right here on the homepage, from a design standpoint, we have a metaphor like, oh, I click on that card and then it grows and it shows me more information, right? So there's this sort of design approach. But when we're actually trying to implement these things, sometimes we actually have to throw out that metaphor because that could misguide us. Because otherwise we're going to think, how can I change my card component into the landing component of the house? It's like, and you try and think through that, and then you realize like this is actually going to be quite difficult to do from a technical standpoint and has other side effects at the same time. So I think in some situations you could do that, and that's a nice thing to do, to morph it based on the route. We've already seen an example of that. But sometimes what you have to do is basically smoke and mirrors. So I'll give you a little hint. When you click on this, this doesn't change into this. What happens is, just from a high level, when you click on it, we render another component called an animation transition component. And that animation transition component has the coordinates of this image, and then it renders it immediately, and then it knows its destination size. So no matter which one you pick, it says, okay, give me the dimensions, and I'll render basically a mock of your old card morphing into the destination. And then as soon as it's complete, it unmounts, disappears, completes the route transition, and then it looks as if you transitioned into the route. So it's smoke and mirrors, the whole thing. There's no real transition of the original component. It looks like it, right? So let's see here. Yeah, there you go. Okay. So let's just have a quick look at that. I'm going to check out master here so you can see, and we'll just touch base on it for a minute. Yeah. Actually, this will do. Just revert everything. So let's just revert those changes. Cool. Okay, so we're back to master. Actually, I'll need that. So all of this happens in house card. And so here's our old house card. That's the one I walked you through. Here's a different one that I'm actually using now in the final version. So it's called house card with animation. So it's obviously a little bit more complicated. It still renders the card that has all of the styles for the original card. And whenever you click on that, instead of using the link component like we were using, we actually handle that within this component. So we click on that, and here's like a little bit of not niceness. We have a ref to the image, the actual image. So this is like where you kind of go off. If you start reading more on React, eventually you find you can actually get references to DOM nodes within React, okay? So you're actually now talking to a real DOM node in your browser. So we get the bounding client rectangle. So this is browser land. This is web standards land. We get the bounding client rectangle. So this gives us the exact coordinates of that image on the house list component. Okay, so we grab that, And then we set the state, okay, go to the house, and then we're going to use that to declaratively render the transition and set the dimensions. Okay, so we do that. If go to house state is true, then we render the animate transition to house declarative component, which takes care of all of this smoke and mirrors. Okay, so there's not too much has crept into our house card with animation. We just have to handle the click and hand some DOM values into our animate transition to house. So let's look at that animate transition to house, because this is kind of where the magic really happens in this component. So again, this is a React component, and there's two stages. So if you think about it, we've got to render an initial state, which is just the image. And then we have to say, okay, now I want to change it to the destination. And we're just going to trust CSS transitions to take care of the smooth change from your initial render to the final destination look. And then as soon as we've done that, after animation duration, so that's 180 milliseconds, then we're going to mark our state as complete. So let's look at what happens here. When the state's complete, we just render a redirect, which automatically puts us over to the destination route. But for that 180 milliseconds, we're in charge of making smoke and mirrors of old image, change it into a larger image. So that's how this happens here. So the animation component here is just CSS, changing some props on some CSS from an initial state to a destination state. So I'm not going to dig too much into that. You can kind of see the basics here. You have to set some timeouts because we want to change the states after a period of time. But yeah, so questions would be great. Yeah, you maybe could, but I'm not 100% sure that CSS, I don't know. I guess I don't know. I think, does it work on like keyframes or? Yeah. That might be nicer than the timeout. Yeah. I think, yeah. That would be a nice thing to do. When so I did something very similar to this a couple of months ago, which is where I kind of learned some of these fun techniques. And the CSS animation completion event had some snags with it. But I'm not 100% sure like all the details about why that didn't work for us. So that's why I did the set timeout, because I know it works this way. But I think there would be something to investigate if it would work in your situation. And cool. Any other questions? Because I think that's it through the talk here. Let me just check if there's any other. Yeah, so I just have some resources to link to there. But yeah, any other questions? Want to hear, Chris? For the transition there, we're using the router. Yeah. Yeah, you could do that. I wanted the animation one to not know about the ref of the actual image. So that's kind of how I approached it. But yeah, you could divide those lines a little bit differently on presentation. Going back to the first animation you showed. Yeah. The way that you had that set up, would it be possible to make it so that you wouldn't be able to scroll back to the left so the map was there? Because I noticed when you did it that scroll back to the left, the map was still there. Yeah, so this one here, if you look at the finished one, you can't scroll back to the left now. So when I showed you kind of the intermediate where we hadn't hidden the overflow, at that point we could scroll back and forth and we could see everything. So the finished product hides that and you can't scroll within it. It's full width of 100% and there's no scroll bar. You can't get around it. Yeah. It's really great to see the animation and demos, by the way. We'll just forget about them entirely. Yeah. I comment about the first animation as well. You don't want to Yep. Yeah, it would be maybe more efficient. Yep. Yeah, I like that point. Cool. Thanks. So what's your name again? Shalana. Shalana's point was that instead of using like left offset, which is what I just used, like a left CSS property, if you change that, it's going to re-render everything, whereas you could use a transform declaration or property, and then it wouldn't re-render everything. It would just adjust the offset. So it would be more effective, more efficient. Oh, this Val.
What do you think is the point at which you will switch big application from React 3 or React Chapter 3 to React Chapter 4?
Yeah.
This order point or line.
Yeah.
So I have to switch now.
Yeah.
Versus I can live with React 3.
Yeah, I guess. So the question, Val's question was, what's the cutting point at which you would migrate a version 3 project to a version 4 project? So I guess the answer depends on the size of the project, because if it's small, like the APIs are similar enough that I think it's not going to take you a long time. If it's huge, then I think there's things that you could do to get closer to version 4 in version 3 and make that transition easier. But to me, it seems that the question is more about debt, like technical debt, as far as staying on an old version. Like if you were on an old version indefinitely, it seems that you would eventually updates are not going to come as fast. And I feel like conceptually, I really like React Router 4 much more than version 3. Like it just makes way more sense as far as how it's organized. It's component driven. It feels smaller and slimmer and less kind of hacky in a way. So I feel like there's a push, in like a personal push for me to, I would move pretty quickly if I could, but it, you know, a very large app.
Another question. In React Router 3, all the routes were in one place.
Yeah.
And now you have to use find all and browse all your components to find the route.
Yeah, so you can.
Disadvantage, or how
I think that the advantage is in what you can do within your routes. Like when you are deep within a route, you can very clearly see how you change something based on a route. And if you have a large application where you have multiple sections of that application, the routing for each of those sections can be independent and unknown about at the top level, which seems like there's an advantage there as well. Mm-hmm. Any other questions? Kind of peering out through the sunlight. All right. Well, cool. Thanks, guys. And yeah, so you can get the slides here if you want. And there's a link then to all of the source code and everything as well from the slides. So thank you.
So thank you, Sam.